Hi, I'm Charlene Freeman, and welcome to my watercolor tutorial for painting these tulips in an old milk can. For this painting, I used Arches hot press watercolor paper, 140 pound, 9 by 12. When I work with ink, such as in this ink and watercolor painting, I prefer hot press because of its smooth surface. It allows me to get my ink drying down very smoothly without all the bumps that I might get if I used a more textured paper like cold press or rough. If you're not comfortable drawing directly in ink, you might want to start off drawing with a pencil, a 2H or lighter, and a kneaded eraser. Once your pencil line drawing is in place, it's time to use a waterproof black ink pen. I absolutely love the Platinum Desk pen, and it's fairly inexpensive at about $15, but Micron pens work really well. I used one watercolor brush for this entire painting, my black gold 311 round size 000. You'll need water in a water container, paper towels, and my palette is filled up with all Daniel Smith watercolor paints. For this painting, I used green gold, sap green, cobalt teal blue, which is a lovely granulating teal color, indigo, quinacridone gold, quinacridone rose, and rose of ultramarine. This painting was inspired by a photograph I found on pixabay.com. Pixabay.com is a great resource for artists. Most of the photographs on this website are both copyright free and attribution free. Here's my finished drawing. As you can see, I simplified it compared to the reference photo. And I did add a few more tulips in the back center part of my drawing to give the bouquet a taller profile than it has in the reference photo. Other than that, I followed pretty closely what I saw in the reference photo. You should always give yourself permission to modify your reference photo. Remember, that photo is a starting point, just the inspirational jumping off point. Then go in whatever direction you want to for your own painting. I started by painting in just water on the left-hand side of the milk can. I'll put the first few washes of this milk can down quite watery, especially on the left-hand side, which is lighter. And I painted with water about 2/3 of the way over across the milk can. I'll paint the milk can in a couple of layers to build up the value, and then lastly to also add the texture of the more aged metal of this can. I start off by focusing on that yellow warm highlight that I see running along the length of the can. And for this, I'm using a very watery mix of just quinacridone gold. I brush it in with vertical brush strokes to capture the texture I see in the can. And then I start painting again very watery with my cobalt teal blue. This cobalt teal is a granulator, and as it dries, it creates a lovely sort of patina that I love for these metal cans. With most of my watercolors, I start off with the lightest values first, which means with the most watery mixes. Once these layers dry, I'm better able to figure out how dark I need to get. But if I start off these initial layers really dark, it's almost impossible to build up without overworking the painting. On the right-hand side, I haven't added any water, and it is darker, as you can see in the reference photo. So I mix, again, very watery indigo in with what was left on my palette of that cobalt teal blue, and I start painting in the shape of the shadow. I'm painting a watery mix onto dry paper, but I'm also painting it on top of an area that I have just painted, which is still damp. so that I don't get any hard edges between the light, the middle, and the dark values that I see in the can. When we paint cylindrical objects, we want to aim for really gradual transitions in values. If we paint in a hard edge, it'll give the impression of having a hard edge instead of a cylindrical edge in the object. I know we'll get much darker as the painting progresses, but this is a nice, safe way to start identifying which values go where and then build up the painting gradually. Even as I paint in this watery mix of indigo, I'm painting it in sort of a stripy fashion, letting some of the lighter colors I painted earlier still show through in that middle part of the can. I pick up more watery cobalt teal blue and indigo, and I just dab them in as I see fit. For this can, I'm not adding water to my mixes. If I add water to these mixes, when I touch that can with my brush again, I'll start creating blossoms. Here I've picked up a thicker mixture of indigo and I'm darkening up the very darkest shapes that I see in the can. I'm doing this while that first layer is still slightly damp, so again, I don't get hard edges. It's time to let the paint dry, and so I'll turn my attention to those tulips. For the tulips, I start off with one of my favorite colors, quinacridone rose. Again, I'm starting off fairly watery. I don't want my tulips to be all the same dark value or middle value. I start off with these light washes, and then I can build up paint as I move along, picking just a few spots where the paint can get thicker and darker. I've obviously given myself permission to deviate from the colors that are in the reference photo. You can make your tulips whichever colors you prefer. As I paint in these first layers of color on the tulips and really throughout the whole painting, I don't follow the outlines of my ink drawing terribly closely. I think it gives it a more spontaneous and loose look if I don't exactly follow my drawing. Sometimes I'll paint outside of the lines, sometimes I'll paint slightly inside, leaving little white marks of the paper underneath. I find that if I paint too closely to my line drawing, it ends up looking a little bit like a coloring book. The nice thing about painting these initial washes so watery is that you have more time to mix colors. They're not going to dry immediately on your paper. So here I rinse out my brush and I pick up more quinacridone gold and I paint it in to a few of the petals of some of these pink tulips. Since the pink is still wet, as I paint the yellow into it, they create some really lovely shades of orange between them. I don't over brush stroke in these new colors. I place them in, I encourage the colors that are on my paper to mix on their own, and I get out. It's really easy to overwork a watercolor, so I try to remind myself, get in, get out. Don't spend too much time nitpicking with your brush at any area you've painted. Here I'm using very watery Rose of Ultramarine. Rose of Ultramarine is another beautiful granulating color. Daniel Smith makes it by combining ultramarine blue and quinacridone rose. For the pink tulips, I used quinacridone rose and then quinacridone gold. But for these more purpley tulips, I'm mixing both the rose of ultramarine and then on the tips adding very watery cobalt teal blue. Here you can see that the puddle on my palette is slightly thicker than the puddles I've been using thus far. And you can see that when I paint with paint from that puddle, how much darker it appears on my painting. I add the darkest touches of this to the purple tulip where it's closest to its stem, and then I have the tulip get lighter as it goes up. For this other purple tulip, I painted in a very dark purple center, like I see it in the reference photo. But then instead of surrounding it with yellow and orange, I surround it with just a touch of that rose of ultramarine and watery cobalt teal blue. I rinse out my brush and go back to using quinacridone gold. I don't really have a plan in mind. I just know that I want my flowers to be a combination of quinacridone rose, quinacridone gold, rose of ultramarine, and teal blue. While that quinacridone gold is still wet, I'll pick up some quin rose and paint right next to it, letting those colors blend together. You can see I've also picked up some of the purple from the tulip beneath it, which was not completely dry, and I let some of that purple bleed into this tulip. I really like the way the watercolors can bleed into each other, and it's up to you how much or how little you want to do of that. Having an ink drawing allows us to let the colors blend a lot more than if we didn't have a drawing. This ink outline really defines the shapes of our flowers for us, so we don't have to rely on just the paint and the color we're putting down. On the other hand, if your colors really start to all blend together, instead of having distinct rose colored tulips and purple colored tulips, you might end up with just all the same colors swimming around together. So pick and choose where you allow colors to blend together. If you find that you've painted one shape next to something that was damp and now the colors are blending together too much and they're traveling into each other more than you want, you can stop that travel by just using your towel. You'll see me use that technique in just a few minutes. To paint the stems and the leaves, I use a combination of green gold, which is a very yellowy gold, sap green, which is a medium green, and then for my darkest greens, I'll mix a touch of indigo into my sap green. I try to pay attention not to let the green and the pinks mix together, or even the greens and the purples. They're too close to being complementary colors, and if they blend together, they'll start making browns. I want to let the bouquet dry a little bit before I blend too many more colors into it. So I turn my attention back to the milk can. And I'm starting with another layer of watery indigo, painting it carefully where I see the darkest shadows and the darkest shapes. I'm using the same brush for this entire painting. It's a round brush with a nice tip on it. So for these smaller details, like the metal handle, I use the same brush. I don't go down to a smaller brush. I just put less pressure on it so that I'm able to create a much thinner line with the tip of the brush. If you're not comfortable doing that, feel free to reach for a smaller brush as you paint smaller details. Now I come in with the brush that doesn't really have any paint on it, it's just slightly damp. And I soften the edge between the dark indigo shadow and the rest of the milk can. Basically, I clean out my brush and my water, and then before I start smoothing out any paint on my painting, I tap that brush out on my paper towel. You can't see that because I'm doing that off camera, but the brush is almost dry. That allows me to soften the edges of the paint I've put down there without worrying about creating blossoms. Blossoms happen when you touch an area in your painting that's starting to dry with a brush that's loaded with water. That would create those blossoms that I want to avoid. I want my can to look nice and smooth and cylindrical. It's time to let this second layer that I just painted on the can dry, so I turn my attention back to the tulips. I'm using the same colors, mixing quinacridone gold with quinacridone rose for my more pinkish tulips. I'm making some of the tulips just quinacridone gold, and then mixing my rose of ultramarine with cobalt teal light for the more purpley tulips. I'm still painting fairly light colors on these, so you can see the puddles in my palette are fairly watery. And as I get them all painted in, I'll start making my paint slightly thicker. Not everywhere, I just will touch a few spots here and there on the tulips with the darker paint. Typically, this will look better if you put your darkest spots where the tulips maybe are bunched together and they're causing shadows on each other, or closer to the bottom of the flower where it connects to the stem, and let other areas be lighter. If you're getting too much bleeding between colors or you find that you put down too much paint at once, you can use your brush as a sponge and pick up that paint, or use your towel to just tap on it lightly. I'm just bouncing back and forth between doing leaves and doing tulips, and then doing light green parts of leaves and the dark green parts of the leaves. It's not really a step by step that you have to follow in the same way I'm doing it. I'm really bouncing around my bouquet looking for areas that are drier than other areas that are safe to paint next to. Here you can see I'm picking up some of that green because it's traveling too much into that purple tulip at the bottom of the stem. So I just picked it up with my towel. If you tap lightly with your towel, you'll just pick up some paint. If you press down hard, like I did here, you won't only pick up paint, but you'll also sort of dry out that spot so that there's no more traveling between those two colors. As I paint in the light green stems, to make them really stand out and look like they're in front of darker leaves, I start to paint in the dark green shapes in between the light stems. You want to be sure that those light green stems are completely dry before you start painting the dark green shapes next to them. If they start blending together, you'll lose that three-dimensional quality that we're trying to create. Again, if you're not comfortable using the same size brush for the entire painting, you can do these smaller shapes by picking up a smaller brush. You can see here how little pressure I'm putting on my brush. I'm really painting with just the tip, so I'm able to paint some pretty small shapes with it. While the bouquet has a chance to dry, I pick up quinacridone gold and quinacridone rose and paint in those three little petals that are at the bottom of our painting. And then I go back to painting in the first layer on the rest of the tulips and the leaves. In addition to painting in the tulips and leaves I haven't painted yet, I'm starting also to paint in some dark spots here and there on the tulips I've already painted. This one, for example, has dried now and looks really pale to me. So I add just a touch more of that lovely quinacridone rose. So I paint in a few more tulips and then I assess the ones that have dried already, such as the one on the far left, and I add another layer of fairly watery color to it. Not everywhere, just touching it here and there to give it more texture and more interest. I want the areas I've just painted in on the bouquet to have a chance to dry so that things aren't all bleeding together. So I'm going to turn back to our milk can. And you can see on my palette that I have indigo fairly thick now to paint in the metal handles. The rest of the milk can is totally dry, so I don't run the risk of these handles bleeding into the can. When you're painting those handles, try not to paint it by picking up your brush and putting it back down, picking it up and putting it back down. It'll be really hard to get a nice, smooth handle if you're picking up your brush a lot as you make that stroke. Try to load up your brush with enough paint to paint the entire handle in one stroke. And with those darkest areas of the can painted in, I can now tell that I have plenty of room to make the shadow darker. So I start painting in some of the darkest indigo I see. Here I'm using just the slightly damp tip of my brush to soften the shadow I put in. And now I want to do an overall unifying glaze on this can. What I mean by that is picking one color that I can use to paint the entire can so that the highlights and shadows don't look so distinct and stripy. I created a puddle on my palette of cobalt teal blue. It's at a milky consistency, so thicker than the original wash, but not really thick. And I will paint this over the entire can, giving it this bluish tint. I really like this color for painting metal objects. I go right over the lightest highlights that I left and my darkest shadows. And this has the effect of unifying all of these different colors and shapes that I've painted into one object. You don't have to use cobalt teal blue. If you want to try for a different color to unify your can, you should feel free to do that. Just keep it milky and not too thick so that all the work you've done up to this point shows through it. I love doing unifying glazes like this. They feel kind of magical to me, the way they just pull the object together. I know I'll want to darken the shadow on the right-hand side of that can, but I need to give that cobalt teal blue layer a chance to dry. So I'm going to turn my attention back onto the bouquet. Be sure you're getting a variety of greens, even if you're not using both a green gold and a sap green. Maybe you're just using one green. Add yellow to it for the lighter areas and add indigo to it for the darker areas. I've seen so many beautiful floral paintings get ruined because so little attention and variety is given to the leaves and stems. So be sure you make those as interesting as the rest of the painting. It takes some time to observe my flowers and see what needs another layer of purple or another layer of yellow or rose. And I add it really watery, shifting the color ever so slightly. I do the same with the 3 petals at the bottom of the painting. Again, now that my tulips have dried, I can see that most of them have faded too much. And this is typical of watercolors. The more water in your mix, the more they fade as they dry. So I'm coming in now with fairly thick quinacridone rose and adding some pretty bold spots to those tulips. Be sure you don't overdo this because then you won't end up with tulips that have a nice variety of light, middle, and dark values, but they'll all start becoming middle and dark values. We want to keep some areas of those tulips light and fresh looking so that they do appear to be struck by light. So at this stage, I feel like we're just filling in the last few shapes of this puzzle that we haven't painted yet. I'm using the same technique and the same colors. As more and more of the painting gets finished, I'm feeling confident about coming in and putting in the darkest shapes. So here you can see how thick that sap green is on my palette, and I've even added a touch of indigo to it. So this will give me some nice dark greens. I find that often students are too timid about getting really dark colors in, but it's having a few spots of really dark against a lot of light and middle values that will give your paintings depth and a wow factor. You can really create drama if you're willing to have lights, middles, and dark values throughout your painting. And here I'll come in and paint some of those dark shapes between my lighter stems. And you'll see how they really help those stems stand out and pop forward. Having those darker values next to the lighter ones really helps you identify the shape of those light values, but also creates more depth. And here I notice one of my green leaves is really traveling into the lid of my can. So I take my towel and press down fairly hard to stop that paint from traveling in. Try to be aware of if you're painting these dark greens next to flowers that are still too damp or wet. We definitely don't want the green overtaking any of your tulips and turning them brown or gray. When green meets any color that is in the pink and red and purple family, it's so close to a complementary that they'll naturally make neutral colors. Sometimes we want that effect, but not in this colorful tulip bouquet. As I get more and more dark shapes painted into my leaves, it makes some of my tulips look even more pale. So I decided to rinse off my brush and get some watery quinacridone rose and perk up a few of the tulips that seem to me that they've just faded away compared to all the other colors that I've put down in the painting. Again, I don't follow my ink drying on this. I like having a lot of these splotches of color go across the drawing. The drawing will hold the subject together for us, so we really do have quite a bit of freedom when we work with ink and watercolor together. I have found that my paintings are more successful if I wait till these later stages of the painting to start popping in these bright colors or bold colors. If I do it too soon in the painting, I might misjudge how much I should put in or how dark I should get. So I like to tiptoe up to it, slowly building up from those watery initial glazes to these bolder, thicker splotches of paint. And it's also time to put in the wooden handle on our milk can. Rather than introduce yet another color, a brown, I'll make my own brown from the colors that are already in my painting. So I mix quinacridone rose with sap green. You might want to play with the ratio of how much rose to green you're using to get the brown you want. For a lighter brown, I just add water, and for a darker brown, I add more paint to my mix. And I paint in that handle. I paint it in fairly dark, and then with a dry brush, I'll come along and lift out a highlight down the center of it. A dry brush can act like a sponge for you, lifting out the color where you want it lifted out. Here you can see I've mixed up more of that brown to get even darker. It's a pretty thick mix. While I let that brown handle dry, I make a nice mix for a very skinny shadow underneath the milk can where it touches the table. For that, I get a little bit of indigo watered down and mix it into my cobalt teal blue. I paint in a very small sliver of a shadow where they touch. This helps ground the can to the table. And then I use that same mix to darken the shadow on the right-hand side of our milk can. I'm pretty confident I can go this dark with that shadow because I'm comparing it to how dark that wood handle is. And then before that shadow has a chance to dry, I come in with my barely damp brush and soften the edge. When it comes to painting shadows and highlights, I rely heavily on a well-lit reference photo like the one we have here. It's really difficult to make up light and shadow, so I try to follow it pretty closely. I see that dark shadow on the right, then there's a little strip of highlight, and then it gets slightly darker again right down the center of that can. And then it's really light on the left-hand side. So I imitate that pattern of light and dark. And here I lift out just a bit of brown from the handle down the center to give it the highlight I see in the photograph. And here is my completed watercolor and ink painting of tulips in a milk can. I hope you found this tutorial enjoyable and useful. And as always, thanks for joining me.